The day started like any other, a mix of monotony and mild irritation at work, capped off by the numbing comfort of the evening routine. I parked my car in the driveway of our two-story suburban home in Columbus, Ohio, and sat there for a moment, flipping through emails on my phone. It was a habit, delaying the inevitable transition from work stress to family tension. Laura had been distant lately. Nothing overt, but there was a palpable shift in her energy. Less eye contact, fewer sarcastic quips, and definitely fewer goodnight kisses. I'd chalked it up to the grind of life. Bills, work, raising her daughter Madison. All of it stacked on top of the invisible weight of a 15-year marriage. As I stepped into the house, the faint aroma of lasagna greeted me. It was one of Laura's go-to meals, and for a second I relaxed. Familiar smells, familiar roles. "Hey, I'm home," I called out, dropping my briefcase by the couch. Laura poked her head out from the kitchen, her blonde hair pulled back into a loose bun. She looked tired. No, more than tired, haunted. "Hey," she said softly. "Dinner's almost ready." Madison wasn't around, which wasn't surprising. She had a part-time job at a nearby cafe and usually stayed out late. Not that it bothered me. In fact, sometimes her absence was a relief. At dinner, Laura was unusually quiet, pushing her food around her plate like she was contemplating life in a bad indie movie. "Everything okay?" I finally asked, breaking the silence. She looked up, startled, as if she'd forgotten I was there. "Yeah, fine." Her eyes lingered on me a beat too long, and I felt a small knot form in my stomach. Laura wasn't the type to get dramatic over nothing. She was the rock of our relationship. Steady, no nonsense. If she was acting strange, it meant something was wrong. "You sure?" I pressed, trying to keep my tone light. She nodded but didn't answer, instead standing up and carrying her plate to the sink. That night, I was on the couch flipping through channels when she sat down across from me. I turned off the TV, sensing this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. "Chris," she started, her voice low but steady. "Yeah?" Her hands fidgeted in her lap, and I noticed for the first time that her wedding ring was missing. My chest tightened. "I need to talk to you about something," she said, looking me dead in the eye. "Okay." She paused, took a deep breath, and then said something that felt like a sledgehammer to the chest. "I know about you and Madison." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. "You know about what?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. Her expression didn't waver. "Don't play dumb, Chris." "I know." The room seemed to shrink, the air thickening with the weight of her words. My mind raced, searching for a plausible way out of whatever trap this was. "What exactly do you think you know?" I asked cautiously, trying to buy time. Laura leaned forward, her hands gripping the armrest of her chair like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "I found messages," she said, her voice trembling for the first time. "On Madison's phone. I wasn't snooping, but her screen lit up while she was in the shower, and I saw them." My stomach churned. "What kind of messages?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Her laugh was bitter sharp. "Don't insult me, Chris. You know exactly what kind. Flirty. Explicit. Things no stepfather should be saying to his stepdaughter." I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. What could I say? That it was a misunderstanding? That she was overreacting? Both would sound ridiculous in the face of what she'd undoubtedly seen. "How long?" she demanded, her voice rising. "How long has this been going on?" I stared at her, paralyzed by a toxic cocktail of guilt and fear. "Laura, how long?" I hesitated, and that was all the confirmation she needed. She shot up from her chair, pacing the room like a caged animal. "I can't believe this. My husband and my daughter. My own daughter, Chris." Her words hit like bullets, each one sinking deeper than the last. "It wasn't like that," I finally stammered, though even I didn't believe my own defense. "Then what was it like?" she snapped, whirling around to face me. Her eyes were red, brimming with tears she refused to let fall. I opened my mouth again, but before I could speak, she cut me off. "Don't. Just don't. I can't hear your excuses right now." For the next hour, we sat in silence. Laura didn't cry, didn't yell. She just sat there, staring at the floor, while I tried to figure out how my life had imploded so spectacularly. Finally, She stood up and walked toward the stairs. "Where are you going?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "To bed," she said without looking back. "I need time to think." And just like that, she was gone, leaving me alone in the dark with nothing but my guilt and the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. The next morning, the house was unnervingly quiet. I'd barely slept, replaying Laura's words over and over like a bad song stuck in my head. By the time I made my way downstairs, she was already at the kitchen table, sipping coffee. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. She didn't even look up when I walked in. "Laura," I started, my voice rough from the sleepless night. She cut me off. "Don't. Just sit." I pulled out a chair, the scrape of wood on tile louder than it needed to be. "Talk," she said simply, her tone devoid of emotion. "I don't know what to say," I admitted. "Then I'll ask, and you'll answer," she said, setting her mug down. "How long has this been going on?" I stared at her, heart pounding. There was no way out of this, no angle to spin. She'd already seen the messages. 6 months, I said finally, my voice barely audible. She inhaled sharply, her hand curling into a fist on the table. 6 months, she repeated, as if saying it aloud would make it less horrifying. "It wasn't planned," I added quickly, desperate to explain, to justify. "It just happened." Her laugh was cold and bitter. "It just happened? Are you serious, Chris?" "She's 19. My daughter. And you're telling me it just happened?" "I know how it sounds," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "But Laura, things between us, between you and me, they haven't been—" "Don't you dare blame me for this," she snapped, her eyes blazing. "I'm not blaming you," I said quickly. "I'm just trying to explain." "You think there's an explanation that makes this okay?" she interrupted. "Because I'd love to hear it." I leaned back in my chair, running a hand through my hair. There was no winning here, no way to come out of this intact. "How did it start?" she asked after a long silence, her voice quieter now. I hesitated. Did she really want to know? Or was this some kind of trap? "It was small things at first," I said carefully. "She was going through a rough time with school, and I tried to be there for her, to help." "And then what?" she asked, her voice sharp again. "You decided the best way to help her was to sleep with her?" "It wasn't like that," I said, my frustration bubbling to the surface. She what?" Laura interrupted. "She seduced you? Is that where you're going with this?" I stopped short. Saying that Madison had made the first move felt like shifting blame. But wasn't it the truth? Or had I just convinced myself of that to feel less guilty? "She needed someone," I said finally. "And I felt seen, in a way I haven't felt in years." Laura stared at me, her expression a mix of disbelief and disgust. "So this is my fault," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Because I didn't make you feel seen?" "No," I said quickly. "That's not what I'm saying." "Then what are you saying, Chris? That you're a victim in all of this? That Madison threw herself at you, and you were powerless to stop it?" "I'm saying I made a mistake," I said firmly. "A horrible, unforgivable mistake. But it wasn't malicious. I didn't plan for this to happen." Her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, her voice cracked. "You didn't just betray me, Chris. You betrayed our family. Do you even understand that?" The sound of the front door slamming interrupted us, and we both turned to see Madison standing there, her face pale. She'd obviously heard more than enough. "Mom," she said softly, her voice shaking. Laura stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "Don't," she said, pointing a trembling finger at Madison. "Don't say a word." "Let me explain," Madison pleaded, stepping closer. "Explain?" Laura shouted, her voice breaking. "Explain how you slept with my husband? How you destroyed our family?" Madison flinched but didn't back down. "It wasn't like that," she said, her voice rising. "I didn't plan for it to happen." "Stop saying that," Laura screamed, her hands flying to her head. The room fell silent, the tension so thick it felt like it would crush us all. "I can't do this right now," Laura said finally, her voice hollow. She grabbed her coat and stormed out the door, leaving Madison and me standing in the wreckage of what used to be our family. The silence after Laura left was suffocating. Madison stood by the door, frozen in place, her face pale. I could barely bring myself to look at her. The air was heavy with everything unspoken, but I knew the moment wouldn't hold forever. "You shouldn't have come in," I muttered, breaking the silence. "She was going to find out eventually," Madison said, her voice trembling but defiant. "What did you think, Chris? That we could keep lying to her forever?" Her words stung. "I didn't think that far ahead," I admitted, my voice hollow. "But this isn't how it should have come out." Madison crossed her arms, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You're acting like this is all on me." "It's not just on you," I said sharply. "But you walking in here like this didn't help." She stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a slight shake of her head, she turned and walked upstairs without another word. I slumped onto the couch, my head in my hands. The memories came rushing back, unbidden and relentless. It had started with something so small, so insignificant, that I hadn't even noticed the line being crossed. Madison had been struggling with her coursework, stressed about balancing school and work. I'd offered to help her with some assignments, to listen when she vented about her professors. She'd thank me in a way that felt different. Her smile lingered longer than it should have. Her hugs became more frequent, more intimate. At first, I told myself it was harmless, just a young woman seeking comfort from someone she trusted. But then there was that night. Laura had been working late, and Madison and I were alone watching a movie. It was something lighthearted, a romantic comedy, I think, but the atmosphere had shifted. She'd leaned her head on my shoulder, and I didn't move away. I should have. Her hand had found mine, her fingers interlocking with mine in a way that was far from innocent. I looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw something in her eyes that terrified and thrilled me at the same time. "This is wrong," I'd whispered, even as my hand tightened around hers. She'd leaned closer, her lips brushing against my ear. "Then stop me?" I didn't. The months that followed were a blur of stolen moments and suppressed guilt. She'd slip into my office late at night, her excuses flimsy, but her intentions clear. I'd resist at first. Every single time, I'd tell myself it would be the last. But she had a way of breaking down my defenses, of making me feel wanted in a way I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't that I didn't love Laura. I did. But somewhere along the way, our marriage had become a partnership of convenience, a series of routines performed out of obligation rather than passion. Madison had brought back something I didn't even realize I'd lost. Or maybe there was just a lie I told myself to justify it all. The sound of footsteps on the stairs snapped me back to the present. Madison appeared in the doorway, her face set with determination. "She's going to leave you," she said bluntly. "I know," I replied, my voice flat. "And what happens then?" she pressed, stepping closer. "What about us?" "Us," I repeated, incredulous. "Madison, there is no us. There never was." This was a mistake. Her eyes narrowed, her jaw tightening. "A mistake?" she repeated, her voice laced with bitterness. "Yes," I said firmly, standing up. "A horrible, selfish mistake. And now we're all paying for it." She laughed, a sharp, hollow sound. "You didn't think it was a mistake when you were sneaking into my room at night." "Stop," I said, my voice rising. "Or when you told me you loved me," she continued, her voice breaking. I said stop. I snapped, the words echoing in the empty room. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of everything we'd done hanging between us. "Do you know what the worst part is?" she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I believed you." Her words cut deeper than I thought possible. She turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence once again. Hours later, Laura still hadn't come home. I sat on the couch, staring at the clock, wondering if she ever would. When the front door finally opened, I stood up instinctively. Laura walked in, her face unreadable. "Where were you?" I asked cautiously. "Out," she said simply, brushing past me and heading for the stairs. "Laura, please," I called after her. "We need to talk." She stopped halfway up the stairs, her hand gripping the railing. Without turning around, she said, "I'm too tired to talk right now, Chris. Tomorrow?" And with that, she disappeared upstairs, leaving me to drown in the mess I'd created. The following morning was colder than usual, though the thermostat read the same as it always did. Laura was in the kitchen, her movements deliberate as she poured coffee into her mug. She didn't look at me as I walked in, and I didn't dare break the silence. It was Madison who shattered the uneasy calm. She walked in from the living room, her hair damp from a shower, her presence as bold as ever. "Morning," she said, her voice casual, as though nothing had happened. Laura turned sharply, the mug in her hand trembling. Her eyes darted between the two of us, brimming with anger and betrayal. "You've got some nerve," Laura spat, her voice shaking. Madison froze, the smile dropping from her face. "Mom, Don't," Laura interrupted, her voice rising. "Don't you dare try to justify this." I stepped forward instinctively. "Laura, let's not do this here." "Why not?" she snapped, her gaze cutting through me like a blade. "Afraid the neighbors will hear? Afraid someone might find out what a sick, disgusting man you are?" Madison crossed her arms defensively. "It wasn't all his fault," she said quietly. Laura's eyes widened in disbelief. "Are you kidding me?" She turned to Madison fully now, her voice rising with each word. "You're my daughter, my child, and you went after my husband? It's not like that." Madison shot back, her voice trembling. "You don't understand." "I don't understand?" Laura interrupted, her voice nearly a scream. "You think there's anything you could say to make me understand this?" The tension in the room was unbearable. I stepped forward again, trying to mediate. "Laura, please. Let's sit down and talk about this." She whirled on me, her eyes blazing. "Talk about what, Chris? How you betrayed me with my daughter. How you destroyed this family. What's there to talk about?" Madison stood her ground, her voice growing stronger. "This isn't just about you, Mom. You've been so checked out of this marriage. You didn't even notice how unhappy he was." Laura's face twisted in anger and disbelief. "You're blaming me for this?" "I'm not blaming you," Madison said, her voice faltering slightly. "I'm just saying it's not as black and white as you think." Laura let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, it's black and white, all right. My husband is a liar and a cheat, and my daughter is... I don't even know what you are anymore." Tears welled up in Madison's eyes, but she didn't back down. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Mom. I fell for him." Laura slammed her hand on the table, the sound echoing through the room. "Stop it. Just stop. Do you even hear yourself? You fell for him? He's your stepfather, Madison. This isn't some twisted romance novel. This is real life." Madison's lip quivered, but she didn't respond. The silence that followed was suffocating. Laura turned to me, her face etched with pain. "And you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you love her?" The question hit me like a freight train. My mouth opened, but no words came out. How could I answer that? Did I love Madison? Or was it something else entirely? An escape? A way to feel alive again? "I don't know," I said finally, my voice breaking. Laura let out a hollow laugh. "You don't know. Of course you don't know. God, I can't believe I wasted 15 years on you." Her words stung, but I didn't have the energy to defend myself. "Get out," she said suddenly, her voice firm. "What?" I asked, stunned. "You heard me," she said, her eyes blazing. "Pack your things and get out of my house." "Both of you?" Madison gasped. "Mom, no." "Don't mom me," Laura snapped, turning to her. "You're just as guilty as he is. You can pack your things, too." "Laura, please," I started, but she cut me off. "Don't," she said coldly. "You've done enough." Madison stormed upstairs, and I was left standing in the wreckage of what used to be my life. "Laura, save it," she said, her voice filled with exhaustion. "I don't want to hear it. Just go." The finality in her tone was like a punch to the gut. I nodded silently and turned toward the stairs. As I packed my things, Madison appeared in the doorway, a suitcase in her hand. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice hollow. Her eyes searched mine, looking for answers I couldn't give her. When we left the house, Laura didn't say a word. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, watching us go. The look in her eyes was one I'd never forget, an icy mix of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. We drove away in silence, the weight of everything we'd lost pressing down on us like a lead blanket. The motel room was small, dingy, and smelled faintly of mildew. Madison sat on the edge of the bed, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring blankly at the muted TV. I sat in the worn chair by the window, my suitcase propped against the wall. Neither of us had spoken much during the drive. The reality of what we'd done, what we'd lost, was beginning to set in. "What now?" Madison asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer immediately. What could I say? That we'd figure it out? That everything would be okay? Both would be lies. I don't know, I admitted, my voice flat. She looked at me then, her eyes glistening with tears. "Do you regret it?" I hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on me. "I regret hurting Laura," I said carefully. "I regret how this all came out. But not us," she pressed, her voice trembling. I looked away, unable to meet her gaze. The next few days were a blur of tension and silence. Madison and I barely spoke, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I tried to focus on logistics, finding a more permanent place to stay, figuring out how to handle the financial fallout, but it was impossible to think clearly. Laura's silence was the worst part. She hadn't called or texted, and part of me was grateful. But another part of me, a desperate, self-loathing part, wanted to hear her voice, even if it was just to tell me how much she hated me. Madison, on the other hand, seemed determined to talk about us, to make sense of what we were now. "What happens if she doesn't take you back?" she asked one night, her voice hesitant. "I don't think she will," I said bluntly. Madison frowned. "So, what does that mean for us?" I sighed, rubbing my temples. "I don't know, Madison. I really don't." She nodded, biting her lip. "Do you want to be with me?" The question hung in the air like a bomb, ticking down to detonation. "Madison, this what we had, it wasn't real," I said, my voice heavy with exhaustion. "It was wrong. And now, we're both paying the price for it." Her face crumpled, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "So, that's it? You're just done with me?" "I didn't say that," I said quickly, but the words felt hollow even to me. The tension between us reached its breaking point a few days later. Madison had been out for most of the day, and when she returned, her eyes were red and puffy, her expression unreadable. "Where were you?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Talking to Mom," she said quietly, dropping her bag on the floor. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "You talked to Laura?" She nodded, her eyes darting away from mine. "She called me. She wanted to meet." "What did she say?" I asked, my voice tight. She wants me to come home," Madison said, her voice trembling. A wave of relief washed over me, quickly followed by a pang of guilt. "That's good," I said cautiously. Madison shook her head. "She doesn't want you back, Chris. She said she's done with you." I nodded slowly, the words sinking in. I'd known this was coming, but hearing it out loud still hurt. The next day, Madison packed her things. "Are you sure about this?" I asked as she zipped up her suitcase. She nodded, her expression resolute. "I need to fix things with Mom. And I think you need to figure out what you want." Her words stung, but I knew she was right. As she walked out the door, she paused, looking back at me. "Goodbye, Chris," she said softly. "Goodbye, Madison," I replied, my voice barely audible. For the first time in days, I was truly alone. The silence was deafening, the weight of my choices pressing down on me like a physical burden. I thought about calling Laura, about trying one last time to make things right. But what would I say? That I was sorry? That I wanted to come home? She deserved better than empty apologies and broken promises. So I sat there, staring at the peeling wallpaper, wondering if this was the end of everything or just the beginning of something else entirely. The emptiness of the motel room was suffocating. The rhythmic hum of the air conditioning was the only sound, a monotonous reminder of how far I'd fallen. Madison was gone. Laura wouldn't speak to me, and I had no one to blame but myself. For the first time in weeks, I let myself feel the full weight of what I'd done. I'd betrayed my wife. I'd crossed an unforgivable line with her daughter. And now, I was left with the wreckage of the life I'd once taken for granted. A knock at the door startled me out of my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a fleeting moment, I thought it might be Madison or Laura. But when I opened the door, it was neither. The man standing there was tall, with a weathered face and a hard set to his jaw. He wore a plain button-down shirt, the kind you'd see on someone who spent their days doing honest, grueling work. "Chris Miller?" he asked, his voice gruff. "Yeah," I replied cautiously. "Who's asking?" "My name's Eric," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Madison's father." I froze, my mind racing. Eric had never been a part of Madison's life. Not really. He'd been absent for most of her childhood, only popping up sporadically when it suited him. Laura had always painted him as a deadbeat, a man who couldn't be bothered to stick around. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He crossed his arms, his expression darkening. "I want to know what the hell is going on. Madison called me. Told me everything." My stomach dropped. Of course, she called him. Why wouldn't she? She'd been desperate for someone to understand, for someone to save her from the mess we'd created. "I don't think this is your business," I said cautiously. Eric took a step closer, his towering presence suddenly much more imposing. "The hell it's not," he growled. "That's my daughter you screwed around with." "My daughter, you sick bastard." I clenched my fists, trying to keep my temper in check. "I made a mistake," I said through gritted teeth. "A mistake," he repeated, his voice rising. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or missing a payment. This is something else entirely." "I know that," I said, my voice trembling. "You think I don't know that?" Eric stared at me for a long moment, his eyes filled with disgust. "You ruined her life, you know that? Madison's going to carry this with her forever. And Laura? She's been through enough without you screwing everything up." I didn't respond. What could I say? He was right. Eric finally stepped back, his voice softening just slightly. "You've got two choices, Chris. You can stay here and rot, or you can do the one decent thing you've got left in you and leave them both alone." "I've already left," I said quietly. "Not just physically," Eric snapped. "I mean completely. No calls, no texts, no accidental run-ins. You let them move on. Both of them." I nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over me. He was right, of course. I didn't deserve a second chance. Not with Laura, not with Madison. Eric turned to leave, pausing in the doorway. "You stay out of their lives," he said again, his voice low and threatening. "Or you'll answer to me." And then he was gone. The days blurred together after that. I moved out of the motel and found a small apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't much, but it was enough for someone like me, someone trying to disappear. I spent most of my time alone, working just enough to cover rent and food. I didn't call Laura. I didn't try to reach Madison. For the first time in my life, I was truly alone, forced to confront the man I'd become. Months later, I saw Laura at the grocery store. She didn't see me. I stayed hidden behind a display of cereal boxes, watching as she pushed her cart down the aisle. She looked different, lighter, somehow, like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. And then I saw Madison walking beside her, laughing at something Laura had said. They looked like a family again. For a moment, I considered walking over, saying hello, but I stopped myself. Eric's words echoed in my head. Let them move on. So I turned and walked away, leaving them to their happiness. As I stepped out into the cold winter air, I felt a strange sense of peace. I'd lost everything, my wife, my family, my home. But maybe, in losing them, I'd given them a chance to rebuild. And maybe that was enough.